The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the deck of the luxury cruise ship, glittering under the afternoon sun. Passengers sipped expensive cocktails, lounged in designer swimwear, and laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Christian Belmont, billionaire, investor, and certified playboy, was already bored. He leaned against the sleek railing of the VIP deck, nursing a glass of whiskey, watching the world move around him like he wasn't even a part of it. Another vacation. Another week of expensive nothingness. And then he heard her. Music. Not the kind that played softly through the ship's speakers, designed to keep the elite relaxed and spending money. This was different. Sharp. Alive. Christian turned his head, frowning. On the lower deck, near the open-air performance stage, a woman was dancing. And not just moving dancing. Her body flowed effortlessly, every step sharp yet graceful, every movement charged with something real. Her long, dark hair was tied in a loose ponytail, her toned legs moving with perfect rhythm, sweat glistening on her skin under the sun. She wasn't performing for the guests. She was practicing. Completely focused. Completely unaware of the people around her. Completely unaware of him. Christian tilted his head. Interesting. Women always noticed him. They sought him out, tried to get his attention, angled for an invitation to his VIP table. But her? She didn't care. And for the first time in a long time, Christian felt something close to curiosity. Then, as if sensing his gaze, she stopped. Her eyes lifted, piercing, unimpressed. And before Christian could even think of flashing his signature smirk, she rolled her eyes and went back to dancing. Christian actually laughed. Oh, this was going to be fun. Christian Belmont wasn't used to being ignored. Wherever he went, eyes followed. Women leaned closer, whispered his name, tried to find reasons to be near him. He didn't chase. He didn't have to. But this dancer? She had seen him, sized him up in a single glance, and dismissed him. And that? That made her the most interesting person on this damn cruise. He watched her for a few more minutes, studying the way she moved, how her body seemed to tell a story without a single word. She was incredible. The music shifted, and she adjusted instantly, rolling her shoulders, switching from sharp, precise movements to something more fluid. The entire time, her expression stayed locked in focus, her lips pressed together, her mind somewhere far away from the luxury surrounding her. Christian smirked. Time to introduce himself. He set his glass down, strolled down the stairs from the VIP deck, and walked straight toward her. He expected her to stop, to notice him again, to at least acknowledge his existence. She didn't. Impressive, Christian said, stopping just a few feet away, his voice smooth, confident. Do you always practice in the middle of a crowded cruise ship? The woman kept dancing, her movements never faltering. Do billionaires always talk to people who don't want to talk to them? Christian's lips curled into a grin. Oh, she was feisty. Only when they're interesting. Finally, she stopped. Hands on her hips, sweat glistening on her collarbone, she turned to face him. Up close, she was even more striking. Not just beautiful, but strong. Fierce. Like she belonged to a different world than the one he was used to. I don't have time for distractions, she said flatly, reaching for a towel on the nearby bench. Christian tilted his head. And you think I'm a distraction? She grabbed a water bottle, twisted the cap off. I think you're exactly the kind of guy who sees something new, gets bored in a week, and moves on to the next thing that catches his eye. She took a long sip, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. And I don't have time for that. Christian chuckled, shaking his head. Unbelievable. You don't even know me. She grabbed her bag, slinging it over her shoulder, completely unbothered. I know enough. Christian watched as she turned on her heel and walked away. And for the first time in years, instead of losing interest, he felt something that surprised even him. He wanted her to be wrong about him. Christian Belmont had never worked for anything in his life. Money? He was born into it. Success? It came easy. Women? He barely had to try. He knew how to play the game, how to charm, how to make people want him. But this woman, this dancer, had walked away like he was nothing. And that? That made her the most infuriatingly fascinating person he had ever met. He spent the rest of the afternoon wondering who she was. She wasn't a guest, that much was clear. No one from the upper deck would have dared speak to him like that. She worked on the ship. A performer. Maybe? One of the entertainment staff? But if that was the case, why did she dance like it was something bigger than a job? By the time evening rolled around, he had his answer. The main deck had been transformed into an outdoor stage for the ship's nightly entertainment. Guests gathered with cocktails in hand, murmuring lazily about whatever rich people talked about when they had nothing better to do. Christian wasn't paying attention to them. His eyes were locked on the stage. And then, she appeared. She stepped into the spotlight like she belonged there, dressed in a sleek, flowing costume that accentuated every precise movement of her body. The music began, and she moved. Flawless, powerful, impossible to look away from. The other dancers performed well, but she was the one who stole the show. She wasn't just executing steps, she was telling a story. Her body spoke a language Christian didn't understand, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to learn. The performance ended, and the crowd erupted into applause. Christian leaned back, smirking. He wasn't done with her yet. After the show, he found her near the side of the deck, stretching, rolling out her shoulders like she hadn't just left the entire audience mesmerized. He walked up behind her, hands in his pockets. "So, you dance for work," she sighed, not even looking at him. "And you still talk too much?" Christian grinned. "You know, most people would have taken that as a compliment." She turned to him, arms crossed. "Most people don't know the difference between dancing for a paycheck and dancing because you love it." Christian lifted an eyebrow. "That was interesting. And which one was that?" She scoffed. "What do you think?" "I think you don't do anything halfway." She studied him for a moment, not in the way most women did, not sizing him up as a prize, but as if she were trying to decide if he was worth her time. Finally, she sighed. "Sophie." Christian blinked. "What?" She grabbed her towel, tossing it over her shoulder. "My name. Since you're clearly not going to leave me alone, you might as well stop calling me dancer in your head." Christian smirked. "Sophie," he repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue. "Nice to meet you." She rolled her eyes. "Don't get used to it, Belmont." And with that, she walked away again. Christian watched her go, grinning to himself. He should have been annoyed. He should have moved on. But instead, he decided right then and there. He wasn't going anywhere. Christian Belmont didn't believe in giving up. Not when it came to business. Not when it came to getting what he wanted. And right now, he wanted Sophie. Not in the way he usually wanted women. Not as a temporary distraction or a beautiful face to fill the empty space in his life. No, this was different. She had dismissed him, walked away from him, treated him like he was just another rich guy who wasn't worth her time. And instead of bruising his ego, it made him want to prove her wrong. The next evening, he found her exactly where he expected her to be. On one of the quieter decks of the ship, away from the crowds, her headphones in, practicing again. This time, she wasn't just moving, she was fighting. Her brows were furrowed, her movements sharp, her frustration practically crackling off of her. She messed up once, twice, 3 times, exhaling sharply each time, muttering under her breath. Christian leaned against the railing, watching. "Never thought I'd see the great Sophie struggle." Sophie's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Are you seriously following me now?" Christian smirked. "Technically, you're the one who keeps showing up in the same places as me." She exhaled through her nose, pausing the music on her phone. "What do you want, Belmont?" He shrugged, stepping closer. "I want to know why you're mad at your own feet." She rolled her eyes. "I'm not mad at my feet." Christian tilted his head. "Looks like you are." Sophie sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I have an audition when this cruise ends. It's for a major dance company in New York. And if I don't nail this routine, I don't stand a chance." Christian raised an eyebrow. "And what? You don't think you're good enough?" Sophie's jaw tightened. "I know I'm good, but good isn't enough. If I want that spot, I have to be perfect." Christian studied her. He had spent his whole life surrounded by ambition, but hers was different. It wasn't about power or status. It wasn't about making money or proving anything to anyone but herself. She wanted this because it meant something to her. And for the first time in a long time, he actually understood that. He smirked. "All right, teach me." Sophie blinked. "What?" Christian stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Teach me to dance." Sophie stared at him for a long, stunned second. Then she laughed. "That's cute. You think I have time to play babysitter?" Christian grinned. "Come on. You're already practicing. What's one more student?" Sophie scoffed, crossing her arms. "You? Dance?" That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Christian smirked. What? Afraid I'll pick it up too fast and steal your audition? She let out an actual snort. You? No offense, Belmont, but you move like a guy who's had everything handed to him his entire life. No rhythm, no struggle, no soul. You'd fall on your face in 5 seconds. Christian grinned. Then prove me wrong. Sophie hesitated. He could see her fighting it, see her brain running through every reason to tell him no. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was her frustration with her own dancing. Maybe it was the way he wasn't backing down. Maybe, deep down, she was just a little bit curious. Finally, she sighed. Fine. One lesson. If you trip over your own feet, I'm never wasting my time on you again. Christian smirked. Deal. Sophie shook her head, muttering under her breath as she reached for her phone. This is going to be a disaster. Christian just grinned, because for the first time since meeting her, she wasn't walking away. And that was a win. Christian Belmont had done a lot of things in his life. Closed billion-dollar deals, attended exclusive galas, raced sports cars on private tracks just for the thrill of it. But standing here, on the quiet deck of a luxury cruise ship, learning how to dance from a woman who barely tolerated him, this was by far the most ridiculous thing he had ever done. Sophie stood in front of him, arms crossed, looking him up and down like she was already regretting this. All right, let's get one thing straight. You are not going to be good at this. Christian smirked. Ouch. No faith in me at all? Sophie raised an eyebrow. Do you have any prior dance experience? Christian thought for a second. Does drunkenly swaying at charity events count? She sighed. That's what I thought. She took a step closer and reached for his hand. All right, billionaire. Give me your hands. Christian lifted an eyebrow. You could at least buy me dinner first. Sophie ignored him. She grabbed his hands and positioned them, one on her waist, the other holding hers lightly. This is basic frame positioning. You're leading, which means you have to guide me without shoving me around like some clumsy idiot. Christian smirked. Is that your way of telling me I should be gentle with you? Sophie stepped on his foot. Hard. Christian hissed. Ow. Okay. Message received. She smirked. Less talking, more dancing. Christian sighed dramatically. Bossy. She rolled her eyes. Rich boy. Christian grinned. He was enjoying this way too much. Sophie turned serious, lifting her chin slightly. All right. You move when I move. But don't rush. The worst thing you can do is overthink it. She pressed play on her phone, and soft, rhythmic music drifted through the air. She nodded. Step forward on the left foot. Slowly. Christian stepped forward. Onto her foot. Sophie groaned. Seriously? Christian laughed. In my defense, you weren't very clear on where your foot was going to be. Sophie shoved his shoulder. Try again. Christian tried again, and again, and again, and he sucked. By the 10th failed attempt, he was breathing harder than he had in years. His brain hurt from trying to keep up. His feet were absolutely not listening to him, and Sophie looked like she was debating throwing him overboard. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. You're thinking too much. Christian scoffed. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm trying not to humiliate myself. She shook her head. That's your problem. You're trying too hard. Dance isn't about following rules. It's about feeling the music. Christian tilted his head, watching her. That why you love it? Sophie blinked, like she hadn't expected the question. What? Christian shrugged, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. I've seen you, Sophie. You don't just dance because it's a job. You dance because it's you. Sophie's expression shifted. For a second, she wasn't the sharp, sarcastic woman who had been brushing him off for days. She was just someone who loved something so deeply, she couldn't explain it. She cleared her throat, looking away. Don't think you can distract me from how bad you are at this. Christian smirked. Worth a shot. Sophie sighed. All right, let's try something different. She took a step closer. Too close? Christian could feel her warmth now, could see the way a single loose strand of hair had fallen from her ponytail. She wasn't looking at him like a billionaire anymore. She was looking at him like he was just a guy struggling to keep up. Close your eyes, she said softly. Christian raised an eyebrow. You trying to rob me? She groaned. Just do it. Christian hesitated, then slowly closed his eyes. Sophie's voice was calm, steady. Stop thinking about the steps. Just feel where I move and follow me. Christian swallowed. This was new. Trusting someone else to take the lead. Letting go. But he did as she said. The music played, Sophie moved, and he followed. And for the first time that night, he didn't mess up. When he finally opened his eyes, Sophie was smiling. Not smirking. Not teasing. Actually smiling. And Christian Belmont, the man who had never worked for anything in his life, felt like he had just won something far more important than a dance lesson. Sophie had spent the last 4 days trying to shake Christian Belmont. She had ignored him, dismissed him, even insulted him outright. And yet, he was still here. Still standing in front of her, still trying. And that was starting to get under her skin in a way she didn't like. Because Christian Belmont wasn't supposed to try. He wasn't supposed to care. He was supposed to be just another rich playboy looking for entertainment, and the second things got too real, he was supposed to walk away. But he hadn't. He had kept showing up. He had stood on this deck, failed spectacularly at dancing, humiliated himself, and instead of giving up, he had laughed. And then, tonight, when he had finally gotten it right, when he had let go of the arrogance in the act and actually felt the music, she had seen something she hadn't expected. He wasn't pretending. Sophie pulled back slightly, her hand still resting lightly in his. Christian tilted his head, smirking, but there was something softer in his eyes now. See? I'm not completely hopeless. Sophie scoffed, crossing her arms. Don't get ahead of yourself, Belmont. You're still terrible. Christian chuckled, running a hand through his already messy hair. Brutal. No words of encouragement? No, wow, Christian, that was amazing. I'm so proud of you. Sophie smirked. Not in this lifetime. But despite herself, she was impressed. For a guy who had spent his life surrounded by luxury, Christian had just let himself struggle. No complaints, no trying to cheat his way through it. He had just kept going. That was unexpected. Sophie sighed, rolling her shoulders. All right, lesson's over. Go back to your penthouse suite and tell all your rich friends you got a dance lesson from a professional. She turned away, grabbing her towel, already planning to pretend like this never happened. But Christian didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the railing, watching her. Sophie sighed. Why are you still here? Christian smirked. Maybe I like annoying you. She rolled her eyes. I'm sure you've got better things to do than bother me. Christian tilted his head. Have you considered that maybe I don't? Sophie hesitated, something shifting in her chest. He said it so simply, like he wasn't even thinking about it. And for some reason, that made it worse. Because if he had thrown out some flirty line, if he had tried to impress her, she could have ignored it. But this felt real. Sophie crossed her arms, watching him carefully. What are you doing, Christian? Christian lifted an eyebrow. Standing on a deck, talking to a very judgmental dancer. Sophie shook her head. No. I mean, with me. What is this? A game? A challenge? Are you just waiting for me to fall for your charm so you can move on to the next thing that excites you? Christian's smirk faded slightly. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, softer than she had ever heard him speak, he said, What if I'm not? Sophie's breath caught. No. This was not happening. She had spent her whole life watching guys like Christian waltz in and out of things without consequences. They didn't stick around. They didn't fight for things. They didn't want things they couldn't have. And yet, here he was. Stubborn, persistent, completely unaffected by all the ways she had tried to push him away. Sophie exhaled sharply. You should go, Christian. Christian studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, Sophie. He pushed off the railing, stuffing his hands into his pockets, and took a few steps toward the exit. But then, right before he left, he looked at her one last time. And the way he looked at her? It made something inside Sophie's chest tighten in a way she didn't like. Because for the first time, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to walk away anymore. Sophie spent the entire night telling herself it didn't matter. That Christian Belmont was just another rich guy with too much time on his hands. That he was just messing around, that he'd lose interest the second something shinier caught his eye. That he wasn't serious. That he couldn't be serious. But the next morning, when she walked out onto the deck, he was there. Leaning against the railing, a coffee cup in one hand, sunglasses perched lazily on his nose, looking like he didn't have a single problem in the world. Sophie stopped in her tracks. Are you kidding me? Christian grinned. Good morning to you too, Sophie. She narrowed her eyes. Do you ever take a hint? He shrugged. I took it. I just chose to ignore it. Sophie sighed dramatically, running a hand down her face. Unbelievable. She walked past him, heading toward the lower deck, but of course, he followed. Come on, admit it, he said, falling into step beside her. You're glad to see me. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. You are the single most persistent man I have ever met. Christian smirked. You say that like it's a bad thing. Sophie stopped walking, turning to face him. Okay, enough. What do you want, Christian? Christian tilted his head, studying her. I want to know why you're so convinced I'm the bad guy. Sophie folded her arms. I never said you were the bad guy. He lifted an eyebrow. No, but you definitely think it. Sophie sighed, exasperated. Christian, I don't have time for this. I have rehearsals, an audition coming up, and a whole life that doesn't involve getting caught up with someone who... She stopped herself. Christian leaned in slightly. Someone who what? Sophie clenched her jaw. Someone who doesn't belong in my world. Someone who isn't supposed to make me feel anything. Someone who I can't afford to fall for. Instead of saying any of that, she shook her head. Forget it. Christian didn't move. He just stood there, watching her with that damn smirk that made her want to throw something at him. Or kiss him. Or both. Finally, he sighed. All right, I'll make you a deal. Sophie frowned. A deal? Christian nodded. Give me one day. She lifted an eyebrow. For what? To prove you're wrong about me. Sophie scoffed. That's ridiculous. Christian smirked. What's the matter, Sophie? Afraid you might actually like me? Sophie's stomach flipped. Damn him. She crossed her arms. And if I say no? Christian grinned. Then I'll just keep showing up until you change your mind. Sophie exhaled sharply. This man was impossible. She should say no. She should shut this down. But instead, for reasons she couldn't even explain to herself, she rolled her eyes and muttered, Fine. One day. Christian's smirk widened. Knew you'd come around. Sophie immediately regretted this. Because the truth was, she had no idea if she would actually be able to walk away from him after today. Sophie had no idea how she had let herself agree to this. One day, one stupid day with Christian Belmont, the man who had spent the last week refusing to take no for an answer. The man who, against all logic, had wormed his way into her thoughts when she wasn't looking. The man who, if she wasn't careful, might actually make her feel something. She had spent the morning mentally preparing herself for disaster. Whatever Christian had planned, it was probably some over-the-top, ridiculous billionaire nonsense. Something flashy and extravagant and designed to impress her in the most obnoxious way possible. She was ready for that. What she wasn't ready for. The simple wooden dance floor on the ship's lower deck, completely empty except for them and a record player. Sophie stared. This is it. Christian smirked, adjusting the sleeves of his button-up. Disappointed? Sophie folded her arms. I was expecting something a little more. I don't know. Obnoxiously rich? Christian chuckled. I figured you'd like this better. Sophie narrowed her eyes. What was he up to? So what's the plan here, Belmont? You make me watch while you struggle through more dance steps? Christian tilted his head. No. This time, you just dance. I'll watch. Sophie blinked. She hadn't expected that. She scoffed. Excuse me? Christian shrugged, stepping back and gesturing toward the dance floor. No rules. No routines. Just dance. Sophie stared at him. Christian Belmont, billionaire playboy, wasn't trying to impress her with expensive gifts or grand gestures. He was just standing there, watching her, like she was the most interesting thing in the world. Sophie exhaled, shaking her head. You're ridiculous. Christian grinned. I've been told. She sighed, stepping forward. Fine. She pressed play on the record player. A slow, rhythmic song began to drift through the air, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the ocean. And then, she moved. Sophie had danced her whole life. She had danced in front of judges, on massive stages, under bright spotlights, in front of crowds that either loved her or tore her apart. She had danced for her future, for her survival, for her dreams. But she had never danced like this, with no one judging her, no expectations, no one watching, except him. Christian stood there, hands in his pockets, gaze locked onto her like he had never seen anything more captivating. And for once, Sophie didn't mind being watched. She spun, her arms cutting through the air, her body following the pull of the music. Every movement was effortless, every step light, every motion completely, undeniably her. And when she finally stopped, breathless, heartbeat racing, eyes locked onto Christian's, she knew she was in trouble. Because for the first time since meeting him, she didn't want to push him away. For the first time, she wanted to know what would happen if she let him stay. Christian smirked. I was right. Sophie exhaled, still catching her breath. About what? His voice softened. You don't just dance. You feel. Sophie's stomach flipped. Damn him. Damn him for saying things like that. For looking at her like that. For making her want him. Sophie cleared her throat, shaking her head. You planned this, didn't you? Christian grinned. Maybe. Sophie rolled her eyes. You're so. But before she could finish, Christian grabbed her hand. Sophie froze. He didn't pull her close. He didn't try to be suave or charming. He just held her hand. Gently. Steady. Like he was waiting to see if she'd pull away. She didn't. And that was when she knew. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real. And she had absolutely no idea what to do about it.